Greetings and welcome to the basement. In this video, we're going to continue our look at the Unity UI system, specifically the three different types of canvases that you can have in the scene. Now we have all three of them present right now. Up towards the top, we have our standard overlay UI. Down here in our mini map, we have camera space UI. And then over here on this box, we have world space UI. So let's take a look to see how these three different types are set up. Let's start off by looking at the overlay canvas because, well, that's the one we're familiar with. That's the one we've been using for the last couple of videos. This is the default mode. When you add in a UI component or when you add in a canvas to Unity, screen space overlay is what your default setting is going to be. It's like I mentioned in the first video, it's an overlay. It's automatically placed on top of everything else. A screen space overlay canvas will never be hidden by anything in the game world. Ever. Unless you've done something weird to your shaders, that is. But yeah, it's an overlay. It just goes on top of everything. And this is very useful for your traditional HUD information, because that's typically not something that you ever want to have hidden from the player's view. But it's not always what you want. So let's take a look at the camera canvas. So what I've done here is, well, actually first, let's take a look at the camera. I have created a camera. Orient myself here correctly. I've created a second camera. I have changed its clear flags to solid color because I don't actually need any skybox on this one. I've changed it to an orthographic, and I've parented it to the FPS controller and set its height at 500 meters above because, well, it's an orthographic, distance doesn't matter, and this helps prevent clipping issues. I mean, I don't really have to have it quite that high up, but it guarantees that I have no clipping issues. Other than that, it's a pretty standard camera. The only other thing I changed on it is I changed the depth to 1. This is to ensure that since this camera has a higher depth than the main camera, the mini-map camera will always be visible. Okay, that's all I've got on the camera, so let's change back to looking at the canvas. So the render mode, of course, I have changed from screen space overlay to screen space camera. When you do this, you have to specify a render camera that this UI is going to target. In this case, I have added in the mini-map camera. This plane distance, in the case of the camera screen space, controls how far away from the camera is this. You can see as I change this value, the UI moves up and down. Obviously, if I set it to something silly like a negative plane distance, it's going to disappear because, well, it's now behind the camera. And drag that back into range and I can see it. And since this is an orthographic view, it's just going to stay in view. Now, if I actually increase this plane distance far enough, let's see here, let's do 800. That should put it underneath the terrain. There we go. Now it's underneath the terrain, which does illustrate something very, very important. There it is, all the way down there, which is when you are using camera space, world objects in the hierarchy can get in between the camera and your UI. So you have to keep that in mind. When you're using camera space, things can get in between your camera and the UI, and you've got to make the decision, is that okay? You can minimize this by setting your canvas fairly close to the camera. So again, in this particular case, I've got a plane distance of 1. Not that it really matters that much as long as I'm using sane values in this particular scenario. Other than that, it's mostly business as usual. The main alteration here is I can't switch to 2D mode. Well, I can switch, but since the canvas is oriented with the camera, and the camera is pointing straight down at the ground, it's not oriented on the positive Z. And when you switch to 2D mode, you're looking down the Z axis. So I can't do 2D mode. I have to switch over and I have to do it in 3D mode. I can still use the rectangular transform tool to get my hints for my distances, but notice I lose all of my snapping. The snapping is only available if I'm in 2D mode, which is unfortunate. So in this particular case, I need to manually adjust things. So I happen to know this one was already set. And I want a 20 offset from the side and a 15 offset from the bottom. So I'm going to need to come over here and do the same and manually set that up. So that way the buttons line up correctly. It'll also be a little bit difficult to tell how they're going to look. I mean, from this particular preview, the buttons look really fuzzy. But if I come over here to game, because they're a lot smaller in this window here, they look okay. Now, the final one I want to go over is the in-world. Now, this one is a bit twitchy to the point where I'm going to do a separate video covering just creating an in-world canvas. Because there's a couple of just twitchiness is really about the best way I can describe it to get the in-world canvases to work. Of course, my render mode needs to be set to world space, and again, I need to specify a camera that this is targeting. In this case, the first-person camera. And the tricky part is getting this to scale correctly. Now, in this particular case, you actually have to change the scale using the scale widget. You can't just resize the canvas. That doesn't work very well. As you can see here that my scale values are set to really freakishly low values. Like I said, in-world canvases are a little bit twitchy. But beyond that, everything still works the same. In this particular case, I can't use 2D view because, yeah, I've got... it's twisted around, and not to mention it's like showing me through the terrain. Even if I got rid of the terrain, you can see that it's not aligned with the Z-axis. It's generally a good idea to, if you're going to be using in-world or world space canvases, that you know, because you're most likely then building this into another game object, building that game object as a prefab in a construction scene, so that way you can look at it dead on through the Z, and build it that way, so that way you can actually use the snaps and stuff. There you go. You can see it. I can take and modify the canvas size to perhaps better line up. Of course, my buttons would need to be a little bit more adjusted. Maybe bring them in like so. And now I can try and position this a little bit better. Can maybe snap it on and then deal with the Z fighting by grabbing the X and just pulling it forward just a touch. I can go to my orthographic view, so that way I can position it nice and neat. Turn my terrain back on. Hit the play button. And there we go. Can't really tell that they're not attached to the box. Now, it is worth noting that with World Space UI, grab this, switch back to perspective here and pull this away. It just exists in the world as a plane that you can see the backside of. So if I'm having the buttons pulled out that far, I can see them from behind, and I can click on them from behind. And yeah, that's going to look a little bit weird. Of course, there's little tricks that you can do to prevent that, but that's quite outside the scope of this particular video. Again, re-snap that on just so that it looks good. Let's see, I need to pull that X out again, just a skosh. There we go. And that pretty much does it for talking about the 3 different types of canvases. Obviously, there's a lot more. There's a lot of additional settings that goes into canvases. You've got the canvas scaler. It's a very important one. I might do a video on that one in the future. The world, not so much, but especially when you start looking at the overlay canvas. This constant versus scale of screen size versus constant physical size can be very important depending on the type of project you're doing. And likewise, you have those, come on, get over here. You have some of those same settings over here on the camera space as well. Okay, well, that does it for this video. So until next time, take care.